Let's talk about She-Ra. So I've reviewed a few episodes of this show in the past, but right now I'm going to be doing something more specific. I'm planning to hone in on each season of She-Ra individually, talk about what they did right and wrong, and give them a score out of 10. Now, I could do them in order from 1 to 5, but I desperately need to get season 5 out of the way, or else my brain would explode. So after this, I'll make one for each season in order. So now that we've got that all set up, let's get on to the review. So, to my surprise, Season 5 is one of the highest rated TV seasons in history, on IMDb at least. Every single episode is rated above 9 stars, and there are some that when I first saw them were rated 10. Needless to say, my expectations coming out of Season 4 were pretty high. I absolutely loved Season 4, so to have the next season dominate it in terms of ratings was pretty exciting to look forward to. So let's talk about some of the reasons why it was rated so high. So, in the early season now, episodes 1 and 2, half of the time was spent on Glimmer and Catra. Every single scene up in the Horde with these two was beautifully crafted to build tension in a way that kind of reminded me of Quentin Tarantino's writing. This show had its fair share of villains, but none quite as terrifying as this portrayal of Horde Prime. While it wasn't made entirely clear, these scenes took place across many months, most likely not in line with the A-plot back in Etheria. So all these scenes in these episodes with our two fallen queens were incredibly paced and built up perfectly to what is arguably the best episode in the season, and I will argue for that. Generally speaking, this episode is, and excuse my French, a fucking masterpiece. This is in my top 3 episodes for the whole show, being essentially perfect, apart from a few things I brought up in my tier list review. While I don't want to dwell on every episode too much, I do just have to say that the work behind the writing in this episode 100% paid off. Every single little piece of doubt placed in the previous episodes came crashing together at cosmic speeds to create a climax of cosmic proportions. This was the high point for the entire season for me, apart from one other little scene I'm sure none of you will recognize. In terms of structure, this is also the most grounded part of the season. I'm incredibly reluctant to talk about the actual meat and potatoes of this episode because I'm definitely not smart enough to make my own points that aren't wrong or unoriginal. Instead, I'm going to link to a video that does just that. So moving on, we have an episode with a great portrayal of redemption and forgiveness, and while many people sack this episode for its place in the season, I think it did well as a calm before the storm. I think it helped pace out the season's flow a bit, and it did have a good message on how to properly seek forgiveness. So, quick interruption here. Save the Cat is actually really copyrighted, and my last video got taken down twice because of it, so I'm just going to be drawing these scenes in MS Paint as I talk about them. Enjoy the video. Save the Cat was one of the episodes rated 10 when I first checked IMDb, and I explained why in my tier list. As a quick recap, this is just one of those episodes where you can't really pinpoint anything that's wrong. Of course, I'm going to do some of that later, but for now, let's just say that it's perfect. The fight scene between Catra and Adora surely did its number on both of them, and it sets up the idea of the chips expertly. As well, it had a nice, goofy B-plot that kind of lightened it up a bit, and it introduced one of the funniest characters in the show, Rung Hordak. So with that, the first act of the season is basically done. These first 5 episodes act as a sort of an introduction to the season, as the tone and subject shift after this. Disregarding the AO3 story, the rest of the episodes are mostly more uplifting and start to transition into the end game. Episode 6 did a great job showing Catra getting over the damage that Prime did to her and started her redemption arc. It also showed off the new She-Ra's powers as well as the true threat the chips had to offer. The momentum at this point started to rise, and the next few episodes only built on it. The Peekaboo episode was a perfect cutback to Etheria after spending so much time in space, and it really started to speed up the show again, with basically most of the planet being revealed to have been chipped. The introduction of Milog in the next episode was quite fun, and there was a pretty well done jump scare in the mix. Rung Hordak really got to shine for the first time here, and his part in the spotlight was quite entertaining. Finally, back on Etheria, the A and B plots merged and the endgame began. This 3-part structure of the series works incredibly well for the viewers, and it keeps you on the edge of your seat. The brutality of the Horde could be shown off in these episodes, displaying even further how much pain and fear it was causing. The chip started to become a general anxiety to all those watching, and that tension was necessary to build up before the last 3 episodes. Also, Catra's slow but sure redemption arc was doing wonders, as well as the constant reminder of her mental damage from Prime's chip. Adora and Catra also started to get closer in these episodes, hinting towards their eventual romance and finally giving the audience some hope. Shadow Weaver's appearance started spiraling everything out of control, having basically no one trust her, and for good reason. And the failsafe now was a crushing pre-finale, as we got to see Glimmer meeting her dad in not so good terms, as well as Catra's doubt starting to get the best of her. The divide between her and Adora was being driven by Shadow Weaver in a master manipulation that took years to pull off. The way she conditioned them as children essentially ensured that they would never be compatible, no matter how much they loved each other. They were what each other needed, but they are also what each other feared. The finale, however, would finally find a way out of this. Shadow Weaver dying without redemption was incredibly poetic, as her last words were, "You're welcome." Even in death, Shadow Weaver was selfish. Either way, a near-death experience snaps both Catra and Adora back into reality as AJ delivers some banger lines. I don't want to get copyrighted, but this image alone is enough for basically everyone to remember perfectly what it sounded like. Catra being canon, albeit very late in the show, was a perfect ending. Finally, the 5-season dynamic between the two concluded at its natural endpoint, and the two can get married now, thank God. Anyone who says this is anything but a perfect love story is homophobic and stupid and also wrong, and their opinion sucks. Speaking about opinions that suck, let's move on to the negatives. Wow. I know a lot of audience members and critics alike love this season and call it perfect and whatnot, but I don't think that could be further from the truth. This season is nowhere near perfect, part of the reason I wanted to review it first.
Alright, another interruption here. I got kind of carried away here, and I tried to be as objective as possible while doing this review, but a lot of my personal biases did get in the way. This season, I kind of harped on it a bit too much for things that I overlooked, and my score ended up being lower than I would like to give it now after even more thought, so keep that in mind while watching this next section.
Let's start from the beginning, shall we? The first few episodes had two plots, one on Etheria and one in space. The ones on Etheria generally lacked structure and were much less profound than in Season 4. Even when they did have some sort of message, it was rather clearly spelled out and fell back on the pattern of speaking down to the audience. Part of the reason why Season 4 and 3 worked so well is because they didn't make their themes and messages painfully obvious to the viewer, and it was more shown and not told. Alongside this, the pacing of the episodes on Etheria started to become rather boring and generic, something that would not go away later on. Corridors, of course, has really only one issue, in that there is a B-plot to begin with. The show really needed a Catra alone episode, and this would have been the perfect spot to put it, but the main crew didn't really add much, and they weren't at all needed, even if the scenes were hilarious and well made. So, moving on, episode 4 isn't important, so again, we're gonna move on to Save the Cat. I want to talk about this episode. This was a turning point for the season in another way besides the one I've already mentioned. It was the point in which the show transitioned from being chaotic and unique to becoming a cookie-cutter final season that has very few original thoughts. Right off the bat, bringing Hordak back was a bad move. Although Corridors did this too, it soon cut him off by having him bathe in that green fluid and lose his memory again. This episode really started a redemption arc that was entirely unnecessary. It actually devalues the ending of Season 4, in which Hordak essentially dies, and the message that was sent about abusive relationships was kind of tainted from that. Aside from this, it essentially puts no limit on who can be redeemed, since Hordak was actually a dictator, even if he was bad at his job. Next on the list is just the entire B-plot. Entrapta was trying to get some sort of schematic or plans or something. That was the entire reason for the team to even be moving out. Wrong Hordak's introduction completely killed the mood in this episode and made it hard to take the rest of it seriously. Don't get me wrong, I love Wrong Hordak, but this was just not the time or place, as well as the fact that Hordak was alive, so introducing him really had no meaning. If Hordak was dead, then introducing him would be funny, and it would be a way to remind us that Hordak was not going to come back. In the end, Glimmer just smashed the server room, so there was literally no point in the B-plot even existing. On top of all this, the pacing just felt weird. There's no way to pinpoint exactly, but everything was moving far too fast, and the audience starts to feel disconnected if that happens. In Season 3 and 4, the show takes its time to dwell and really soaks in all the dread. This episode had the potential to hit like a truck, but instead it just rolled along. The fight scene was incredible and the dialogue was spot on, as well as the animation, but the way it was put together, especially since it had to deal with the B-plot taking up 10 minutes, it just felt too fast. They tried to fit 2 episodes worth of plot into one, and it did not go well. After this, episode 6 was a breath of fresh air. I have no substantial issues to talk about here. However, once we get to Peekaboo, things start to take another turn. This episode, while it is all the nice things I said about it earlier, it's also bordering on a soap opera. At least by the end, the melodrama was turned up to 11, and Scorpia's final line to the camera seemed too cheesy. Even so, this episode shone bright, so kudos. Then we have episode 8, one which kind of bored me, if I'm being honest. Even if it introduced a new character and had one good jump scare, this episode's pacing was not interesting at all. Again, the scenes feel like they're rolling past, and I was not immersed enough to get actually emotionally attached to anything. Rong Hordak was incredibly funny here, but so was Catra, which I found a bit unsettling. She still is suffering mentally from the chip, as shown in scenes that are in this episode, but the group is making fun of her like she's completely stable and their friend of many years. While Catra's redemption arc is amazing, this episode seems to push it a bit too much, and it felt a little awkward. Later episodes before the endgame start to feel so rushed it's insane. Instead of trudging through a dangerous wasteland, the audience seems to be flying in a plane, observing it from above. While Spinnerella and Natasha finally got more screen time and their arc was great, it was also quite, and I repeat, cheesy and overdramatic, with some of the dialogue, especially some of the mannerisms and some of just the scenes in general. It would be distressing to anyone to be in their position, but their reactions were over the top and lacked realism. Also, the sort of power of friendship type theme started recurring, and those two lack realism. It seemed that this part of the season slowly chipped away at the nuances it created for itself, and the interesting episode structure it once had used. The dialogue went from masterful to unimportant, and the jokes seemed out of place, albeit funny. Everything just started seeming like a big mosh pit of characters fighting a large disposable army, something we see far too often in media. Failsafe was actually quite amazing, apart from Micah's dialogue, which needed to chill. They seemed to forget how chip people would talk, and Micah actually kind of seemed witty and aware of comedic timing, something which should not be happening to a robot. Aside from that though, this episode was actually really good. Then we have the finale. A 2-parter that is only going to be remembered by one scene. That scene, however, has a lot surrounding it. The problems I had with the finale didn't come from things sticking out as bad, but from the fact that nothing stuck out at all. Not only did this episode make Horde Prime the most boring stereotype of a supervillain imaginable, it made him a nonsensical, boring stereotype of a supervillain. He was too calculating a villain to let something like this break him, and this snapping was completely out of character. No longer was he terrifying and disgusting, he was just another obstacle with a few too many lines. And now onto the dialogue, which is a big pet peeve of mine. Most of it is pretty standard, but the parts that aren't are usually so over the top and unnatural that they just seem like some sort of 70s telenovela that your grandmother would watch before cooking dinner. I will say that Glimmer reuniting with her dad was a great moment, and her memory of Angela was touching and not too dramatic. She didn't say anything, and she didn't need to say anything. One thing that I thought this show had grasped was the dialogue isn't always necessary. It still abided by that rule for a lot of the season, but it didn't stick to it all the time. With a lot of characters, especially Swiftwind, there were lots of lines that could have been cut to improve a scene's flow and impact. Onto the other more interesting part about the finale, Shadow Weaver. Her death was important, as much so as the Cachadora kiss scene, because those two scenes are incredibly interconnected. While most people, including some members of my own family, believe she ended up redeeming herself by sacrifice, that would go against a lot that the season was trying to say about the matter. It spoke out against sacrifice in numerous episodes, painting it out to be useless and sometimes even selfish, and Shadow Weaver's case was exactly the latter. What I believe, which I think best fits her character, is that she knew Adora and Catra were onto her mind games and were going to end up together regardless. If she stayed alive, she would have had to deal with all the wrath of all the people she wronged, and the fact that she failed in making Adora her war machine. These people she hurt would all be there, and she would have no more tricks up her sleeve. Instead of facing that and trying to fix things, she ended up dying to save Catra and Adora, so they would end up with one good memory of her. Her last words, again, "You're welcome," are truly fitting, as they show her true motivation was improving her own image rather than the lives of those around her. Now, this wasn't made very clear. Lots of things in Season 5 were given through subtext, but this is something that should be put front and center. Shadow Weaver was a bad person, and there should be no debate on whether or not she died atoned of her wrongdoings. The only thing that could do such a thing would be if she lived and faced everyone she ruined. This issue is nowhere near easy to talk about, and it's certainly not a very neat debate, but it's important nonetheless. Now, I didn't mention every single pro and con and every single little aspect of this season, but I did take it pretty much all into account. Some of it just wasn't worth it to mention here. Either way, after racking up everything, all the points and stuff, I have a verdict. I end this video with 2 rankings. I hereby revoke the previous tier of S+ for Save the Cat, and I now give it an A. And the final review for Season 5, the final score out of 10 is a 5.
6. It's a 6. I'm not gonna give it a 5. I'm not that mean. It's fine. Don't worry. I'm not just being stupid. All right, subscribe.